So Tim Wise is a well-known and respected anti-racism activist and writer. As a graduate of Tulane University, he has dedicated his life to training teachers, students, businesses, and nonprofit organizations in methods of dismantling racism in these institutions. He has spoken on over 600 college campuses, and he has written numerous books, such as the two he'll be signing later today, which are entitled Colorblind, The Rise of Post-Racial Politics, and Dear White America. You can get those signed later tonight if you'd like. He has educated thousands of minds about race and the pervasive racism in the United States, and he has sparked hopes of eradicating racial injustice in all of its forms. Perhaps he is best known for his documentary, White Like Me, which the Race and Racism Coalition showed last week, that discusses colorblindness, white privilege, and race relations in America. We are honored to have Tim Wise here with us tonight because we know that he can promote the necessary discussion needed to eliminate racial prejudice on our campus. We hope that in the next hour, Mr. Wise's speech will fuel each individual here tonight to actively combat prejudice, discrimination, and hatred anywhere that it exists. Thanks.
Lauren come up. She's a first year. She's one of our newest coordinators, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about the Race and Racism Coalition itself. And if you'd like to get involved, there's a sign-up sheet on the back table. So for students or for faculty, or for staff, we're always looking for new members and new coordinators. Please give us your information on the back table. Thank you.
What is the Race and Racism Coalition? The Race and Racism Coalition was formed in the fall of 2012 in response to a recognized need for greater discussion on racial inequity on the HWS campus. The coalition is comprised of students, faculty, and staff. The coalition is led by the coordinating team, which works to bring programming and positive change around issues of race and racism to HWS and the greater Geneva community. Some of our past programming is Addressing the Issue, Race and Race Education, 2013, Spring Forum, 2013, creation of Bias and Incident Reporting Forum, Solutions Banner, Geneva Boys and Girls Club Dialogue Training, HWS Race Card Event, I Am Not My Stereotype, Photo Campaign, Race and Education Video, and more. Thank you.
After the lecture, we encourage everyone to come up and see our race card banner over there. The HWS students put that together at our fall forum, and we got it laminated, and it's pretty, and it will soon find a home on one of the walls on campus. And our solutions banner is currently in Stern Hall right now, so be sure to see that as well. Now I'm going to call up Tammy to talk to you about the Bias Incident Reporting Forum.
What is the Bias Incident Reporting Forum? The Bias Incident Reporting Forum was developed as part of an effort to foster a community climate where everyone at HWS is respected and valued. So if you witness or experience an incident of bias or harassment, including those based on race, class, sexuality, gender, disability, and religion, or any targeted identity, you are encouraged to report these anonymously or with details through the HWS Bias Incident Reporting Form, which you can access through the drop-down menu on the main HWS homepage.
And please tell your friends about the Bias Incident Reporting Forum. We got it live on the school website last fall, and the only way that it will actually make change is if the students use it. If you see something, say something. All right. Next, I would really like to thank all of our sponsors. The Race and Racism Coalition has no budget. We have no funding, which we're okay with, because we have the generous donations of so many different groups on campus and offices on campus that have helped us with all of our events so far. So special thanks to the Division of Student Affairs, the Centennial Center for Leadership, Office of Student Activities, Office of Intercultural Affairs, Department of Anthropology and Sociology, William Smith Congress, and Boulevard Student Government for funding tonight's lecture. So tonight's, the lecture will last about an hour, followed by a Q&A session and a book signing. So I understand that different students have academic responsibilities as well. We all know it. So if you have to duck out early, please be quiet. And also, everyone, phones off, not even vibrating, please. So, no further ado, I welcome Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. As you can probably tell, don't normally really sound quite this way, so I'm fighting through, I sort of like it, but I actually like it a lot better than my normal voice, so I'm going to see if I can keep it, but fighting through a little bit of a sinus infection, a little bit of cold, so, when you come up to buy the books, don't shake my hand or anything silly like that. You want to take a picture, don't get too close because you're going to end up coming away with some type of horrible, horrible illness. But I'll be happy to, sell you the merchandise. That was my subliminal way of getting books sold. I do want to thank you all so much for being here. It's excellent to see this kind of crowd. I know it's a very cold evening, so if you had to walk any real distance to be here whatsoever, that shows some real commitment. And then on the other hand, if you're just here for whatever extra credit your professor bribed you with, that's all right too, because I always make sure they leave the lights up so that if you do get up, I'm going to notice it and it's going to be tacky and I'm probably going to call it out. So might as well just sort of hang out, whether you came because these are the issues that you think about all the time or whether it's the extra credit. Either way, just stick around. Hour and a half, you're out of here, go about your life. Before I get started, I do think as a matter of ethical responsibility, there are a few things I want to say up front. I always try to remember to do this, and I think it's important. As happy as I am to see such a good crowd here, I also know, at least in part, that when I go around the country and I speak to institutions much like this, that it is not simply because I, as my mama might say, can talk real good, that explains why folks come out. And it's not simply because, as my mama might also say, I write pretty good, that people come out. There are a lot of fantastic writers, and there are a lot of incredible speakers who speak about these subjects all the time. And yet, they, and I'm speaking here principally, mostly about academics, scholars, activists, and leaders of color, are not responded to in the same way. And when they speak about these issues, they don't get the same levels of crowds and support. They don't always get the same level of book sales or eyeballs on a website page. And so what I'm really wanting to encourage you to think about after this evening is, well, what will it mean when we finally can say that people of color who stand up and talk about race all the time, maybe not even at a speech, maybe just in your classroom, maybe in your residence hall, right? Maybe out in the community, and we have had the luxury of ignoring it. What will it mean when we finally get to that day when it won't just take a white guy who fits the aesthetic necessary to bring these hard truths to institutions that perhaps in some regards aren't always prepared to hear them? I'm glad to do it, and I'll continue to do it because I think that's the work that white allies ought to be doing. But the reality is, and we all need to remember it, that until we are prepared to hear these truths from people of color, we haven't made the progress we like to claim. Just like if we haven't reached a point where we're prepared to hear the truth about sexism and patriarchy from women, and we only can hear it from men challenging other men, we haven't arrived. And if the only people we're willing to listen to challenge straight supremacy, cisgendered supremacy, transphobia are straight and cisgendered people, we haven't arrived. And if the only people we're willing to listen to talk about the class system are people who have enough money, right, then we haven't arrived. We have to be willing to listen and to learn and to hear from those who are the marginalized, who are the targeted. So if my words can help facilitate that, fantastic. But just make sure that the next time there's an event on this campus and there are people of color giving that speech, or other targeted group members giving a speech about oppression, inequality, privilege, please come to that too, right? Whether it's an outside expert who's been brought in, or whether it's your classmates, your peers, your colleagues, people that you sit in the classroom every day, maybe sitting on a panel and talking about these issues, because their insights, their wisdom will be at least as valuable, and I would suggest probably quite a bit more valuable than mine. So thank you for that. I just wanted to be able to get that out and say that up front. I'm also glad when people show up, because I have to tell you the truth, like, you never know what's going to happen, right? We go around the country, you never know if people are going to show up, because I know from 20 years of being on the road that people don't really like to talk about this topic. Nobody really enjoys talking about race and racism, right? People of color don't enjoy it, white folks don't enjoy it. Now we have different reasons for that. People of color, according to the research, this is not just Tim Wise and my own observations, this is actually according to real social science. People of color really don't like to talk about racism, especially with white people in the room. And the reason is they know from personal experience there's a good likelihood we're going to minimize their concerns. We're going to accuse them of exaggerating the problem, making a mountain out of a molehill, playing the so-called race card, which is a phrase we came up with about a decade ago to minimize the lived reality of millions of our fellow countrymen and countrywomen. And so people of color have learned that sometimes it's just easier to shut down, right? It's just easier not to talk about it than to run the risk of being once again pushed to the margins, or maybe even retaliated against for bringing up your own lived experience. Now, white folks are also afraid of the conversation. We don't like to talk about race, particularly in front of people of color. It's not because we're afraid of retaliation. It's not because we're afraid that our concerns are going to be minimized. It's pretty hard to minimize the concerns of and retaliate against a powerful group in the society. So that's not why we get all tripped up about it. The reason we're afraid to have the conversation, according again to the research, is that we're deathly afraid we're going to say something wrong, right? Oh my God, I'm going to say the wrong thing, and that person of color is going to think I'm a racist. Oh my God. Okay, news flash for white people. If you're avoiding the conversation about race with people of color because you're afraid they might think you're a racist, please know this. People of color already suspect you sure as hell might already be. And it's not because people of color are particularly judgmental. They're not being harsh or unfair with it. It's just that they've been in this country a minute. And they know what you've been exposed to. They know what we've been exposed to. They know what they've been exposed to. They know that we've all been exposed to racial stereotypes and racialization of the other, and that is them in this country. And so they know that sometimes they've internalized the hostility toward themselves. They've internalized some of the stereotypes. The odds that you didn't, right, pretty slim. And so people of color already start out with the assumption there might just be a little bit of that racial bias in there. So oddly enough, not talking about it isn't going to solve that problem. In fact, there's a third body of research, and this is the irony of it, right? The third body of research actually says that it's precisely at the moment when white folks shut down and don't talk about race, even when race is the elephant in the room, it's precisely at that moment when people of color are most confirmed in their suspicions that we might be hiding our racism. It's like all of a sudden we shut down because we don't want them to think we're racist, and by virtue of our silence, they're like, see, I think I know why you're not talking. So the irony is we'd be better off to just have the damn conversation and take the risk and screw up and drop the ball and make a mistake and step on toes, but then do what big people do, which is pull up our adult pants and get back to work on these issues instead of running away from them like children who are too afraid to confront the reality, right? So we have to have the conversation. I know people tell you that we shouldn't. In fact, one of the more ubiquitous responses to the work in the last 5 or 6 years has been really aggravating. It used to be philosophical and ideological. Now it's just like these interesting retorts, like people who will say, well, it's people like you that keep racism alive by talking about it. I never heard that one 20 years ago. That's new. Is that some evolutionarily intelligent argument? Like, it used to be we actually argued facts. Now we've devolved to a place where people are like, the conversation causes the problem. If you would just stop talking about it, the problem would go away. Yes, because that works so splendidly well with social problems. Like if I were giving a speech about world hunger, I'm sure you would all agree. Like if I stood up here and said that there are billions of children around the globe who are starving for lack of adequate nutrition, I'm quite certain at least one of you would leap from your seat to say, shh. Good God, fool. Why are you talking about world hunger? You keep talking about that, children are gonna die. That's how that happens, man. Now, on the other hand, if you would just stop talking about it, food would miraculously appear in your place. Because it's magic. Yeah, that works, right? Crime, you worried about crime? I'm worried about crime. I've been held up at gunpoint before. I had my apartment broken into many years ago, my car burglarized. Shh. Why you want to talk about crime, man? You talk about crime, somebody's going to get carjacked tonight. It's a cause and effect relationship like that. If we would just stop talking about crime, we can fire all the cops, empty all the jails, empty all the prisons. What a brilliant idea. Why hasn't somebody thought of that? Because it's stupid as hell. That's why it's not an answer to the problem of crime. You can't solve a problem by not talking about it, and to blame the conversation for the problem is like blaming your speedometer for the speeding ticket you got. The speedometer didn't cause you to go 80 and a 65. It was just a mechanism of transmitting social reality, right? It's just a way of letting you know what you did, which is exactly what our conversations about race are. Now, that's not to say that all conversations about race are equally valid. Just because we need to talk about it doesn't mean any old talk will do, right? It has to be fine-tuned, and it has to be very specific. And one of the things that I've learned over the 20 years on the road, 25 years that I've been doing anti-racism work in some capacity, the first 5 at the grassroots level as a community organizer, etc., is that in many ways, the way that we have defined the problem and understood the problem is the problem, because we haven't understood the problem fully as a society. Some do, and some write about it and talk about it and organize on the basis of it, but for the most part, I think that we've been to some extent misunderstanding the enemy or the adversary or the larger problem. And I can think about this in terms of how I got started with this work. When I began doing anti-racism work, it was I started in college, but in terms of a career path and doing this stuff professionally, I was 1990, I graduated from college, and I was the associate director of the organization that was founded in New Orleans for the purpose of defeating David Duke when he was running for the United States Senate. Now, some of the younger folks in the room won't necessarily know who Duke is. The older folks will know, and some of the younger folks will. David Duke is probably still today, certainly as of the early 90s, this country's most prominent, well-known, overt white supremacist in the last half century. He was the former head of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the United States in the 1970s. He's been a white supremacist since he was 18 years old. I would call him a neo-Nazi, but that would be giving him too much credit, because neo implies that you thought of something new. And David hasn't actually had a new thought since the fall of the Third Reich. So he's sort of a Paleolithic or Jurassic Nazi, I think would be probably the term in geologic terms. Pretty old school Nazi. But anyway, quite honestly, a Nazi, I'm not just saying that. I know like everybody nowadays calls everybody they don't like a Nazi, but this dude actually like, a Hitler admirer kind of Nazi, right? It's not just rhetoric. So David Duke was running for the US Senate in 1990, and I was the associate director, first the youth coordinator, and then later the associate director of the group that was formed for the purpose of defeating him. And you won't remember those days, many of you, but those who do will recall, or perhaps not, but I'll fill you in on it, that although David Duke did lose, he did capture a stunningly high share of the vote. He got 44% of the vote in the Senate race, which he accomplished by getting 60% of the white vote. So 6 out of 10 white people in Louisiana in 1990 who all knew he was a Nazi. It's not like people didn't know and they just made a mistake and they, oh my God, I had no idea it was a Nazi. I hadn't been awake for the last 6 months and you've been talking about it every day. I had no clue. Everyone knew he was a Nazi, and 6 out of 10 white people didn't care. 6 out of 10 white folks were like, yeah, there's that Nazi thing, but what the heck? Let's just vote for him anyway. And the next year he ran for governor. He got 39% of the overall vote, so a little bit worse, a little bit better for us, worse for him. But he still got 55% of the white vote. So in both elections, the majority of white Louisianans perfectly prepared to send an actual Nazi to the United States Senate or the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge. And if it weren't for black folks rushing in and saving us from ourselves, that's exactly what would have happened, because white folks were down with that. And I remember thinking at the outcome of that election, what does this mean? Not for David Duke, right? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for this struggle against racism? And I think, to some extent, those of us who were involved in the movement decided, okay, that's the enemy, right? Maybe not just David Duke. We had a more capacious understanding than that. We understood Dukeism was the problem, right? But even that might not be precise enough, because what we defined as Dukeism and what we saw as the problem in those early days was this sort of deliberate manipulation of racial fear and anxiety by extremist politicians trying to penetrate the mainstream. People like David Duke. Later on the next year, people like Pat Buchanan when he ran for president in 1992. People with a lot of extremist ties to really overtly fascist forces trying to penetrate into mainstream politics. Now, it's not that we were wrong about that. That was a threat. But it wasn't the only threat. And what I came to understand in the last 20 years or 25 years since is that the problem is far bigger. It's not just the David Dukes of the world. It's not just the reactionaries in Congress who also scapegoat people of color for problems they didn't cause, right? Not just David Duke who blames affirmative action for every white kid that didn't get into Harvard. Right? That's a lot of mainstream conservatives that do that, right? Oh yeah, my God, my son didn't get into Harvard because of affirmative action. Okay, here's a little pro tip. If you had been black, right, this is the argument. If they'd been black, they'd have gotten in. Yeah, if you'd been black, you'd have been black for the whole 18 years before you ever applied to Harvard. And your whole life would have been different, okay? So the idea that everything would have been the same, but you'd have gotten a bump because you were a person of color, A, it isn't even true, and B, if you'd been black, you would have been twice as likely to be in a family that was unemployed, 3 times as likely to be in a family that was poor. You'd have been twice as likely to die before you were the age of 3, so forget college, you're not even going to preschool. Right? That's the reality in this country. People like David Duke didn't want to talk about that. They just wanted to make white people think that the reason they didn't get what they wanted was people of color. Oh, they're taking your jobs. What jobs exactly are people of color taking from white people? Right? Are these jobs in Second Life? Where the hell do these jobs exist? Because ultimately, right, every single year in 1990 or today, people of color are twice as likely to be out of work. So clearly they're not taking things from anyone. But again, that rhetoric was being used, still is. And we identified that as the problem, and it was to some extent. So too, David Duke and other reactionaries in Congress and elsewhere like to scapegoat poor folks, and particularly poor black and brown folks, for supposedly taking all of these tax dollars for social service programs, so-called welfare programs. Another little pro tip: if you're going to argue that people of color take all the good stuff from white people, like all the jobs, it is a little inconsistent to also argue that they just sit around on welfare all day. Okay, you really can't have it both ways. Like, I don't ask much from my bigots, but consistency is important. Like, if you take all the jobs, I'm sure you do not qualify for public assistance. And if you are on public assistance, you're not going to have all the jobs. You might not even have any job, right? That's why you were able to qualify, or at least you're not going to have a very high paying one. So just a little consistency. I just don't like my bigots to be moving targets. That's all. I just want to know what we're talking about, right? So this is the kind of manipulation that David Duke and others would throw out there, blaming poor people for problems they didn't create, blaming black folks for problems they didn't create, now increasingly blaming Latino immigrants for problems that they didn't create. And although that is part of the problem I've come to understand and appreciate is far bigger. The problem is that the underlying mentality of Dukeism, which is this idea that people of color get what they deserve and white people get what they deserve. And if white folks are in a better position, it's because we're just better. Now, David Duke would say that's because we're genetically superior. He believes in old school biological racism. But a lot of people who would never endorse that still believe in cultural superiority, right? Well, these folks come from a defective culture. This culture is superior. These people are harder working. In other words, even people that would never vote for a David Duke are susceptible to that mentality that created Dukeism. You know why? Because we've all had it planted in us. And you may not think that's true. You may think, well, that's not true for me. I haven't had that mentality planted in you, but you have. You know how I know? Because it's the one thing that makes us all similar. It's the one thing that if you've been in America long enough, if you've been in the United States long enough, whether you were born and raised here or you just moved here but you've been here for a minute, you've been exposed, like all of us, to the secular gospel of this country. And that secular gospel sets you up to internalize the stuff that made Dukeism possible. What do I mean? What is the secular gospel? What's the one thing we've all been taught? Every single one of us in this country, to some extent or another, regardless of race, ethnicity, culture, geographic region, religion, all of those things. The one thing, right, is this notion that if you just work hard enough, you can make it. Anybody can make it in America. It's that idea of meritocracy, individualism, right? So wherever you end up, it's all about your own effort, don't you know? If you made it, it's because you're the best. If you didn't make it, there's something wrong with you. You should have worked harder. Now, you may think that that's a race-neutral theory, and in theory, it is. But in practice, it's not. Why? Because if you take that theory and you lay it on top of a society with profound racial stratification, what do you think people conclude when they see the inequalities and they put two and two together with the propaganda? If I've been told that these folks are better because they're there and these folks are lesser because they're there, then by definition, if I put those things together, I'm going to conclude that white people just must be superior. Black and brown folks just must be inferior. Men just must work harder and be superior. Women must be inferior. Rich people, by definition, must be superior, regardless of race, and poor people, regardless of race, must be inferior. In other words, racism, sexism, classism become fully normative, natural, and even rational things to fall prey to when you've been given a line about where people end up is all about themselves. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a dad, and I don't want you to have any misunderstanding. When our daughters, as they're now 10 and 12 years old, don't think for a second that we don't tell them that they can be whatever it is they want to be. But you see, the difference between the way that we tell them that and the way the culture tells all of us that is that I always make sure to put the asterisks at the end of that promise, right? Because it's a promise that needs an asterisk at the end that leads you down to the bottom of the page. And the asterisk leads you to the part that says, in order for that thing Daddy just told you to be true, you're going to have to realize that not only will you need to work hard as individuals, but you're going to have to realize that as women, there will be men who view you as lesser, and in order to actually accomplish all that you are capable of accomplishing, you are going to have to join with other women and with male allies to change systemic inequality in the mistreatment of women. The culture doesn't put that asterisk there. The culture doesn't want us to do it, right? In fact, people sometimes criticize me for doing it. They'll say, oh, Tim, you shouldn't tell your daughters that. You're going to give them a victim mentality. You're going to give them a victim complex, a syndrome. Well, I'm just preparing them for the world as it is. To not tell them about sexism as women in this country would be like sending them down a dark alley where there's an electric fence at the end. But I don't want to tell them because I don't want to make them neurotic. Oh yeah, just go run, it's cool. No, it's fine, I checked it out. No, it's cool, really. Just go, just run. And then they get down and then they're like, zap, and they're like, Dad, really? Like, you couldn't tell us about the fence? Well, I didn't want to freak you out. The issue is not a victim mentality, the issue is actual victimization. It happens, and people need to be prepared for it, whether we're talking about class, race, gender, sexuality, or anything else. So we need to put that asterisk, but the culture doesn't do it, and so as a result, young people grow up to become not so young people who've been taught all their life that the structure is normative and the result of effort or the decided lack thereof, and so all of these things sort of become default positions, right? It doesn't mean that everybody will fall for it to the extent that they would go vote for a David Duke, right? But it means that even those who wouldn't take it to that extreme are susceptible to the politics of prejudice and racial scapegoating that underlie Dukeism. And so we've got to realize the problem isn't out there, the problem is in here, the problem's us. See, after the David Duke thing, it was real easy for, I think, a lot of us to sort of draw the line around the bad people who did the bad thing and voted for the Nazi. Because that's easy, right? To say, oh, you're bad, you're stupid, I'm smarter, I'm better than you, right? The reality is, we weren't any better. We just had some information that the other folks didn't have. We'd had some personal experiences that the other people hadn't had. Maybe we'd been raised a little bit differently, right? And in my case, there was something, I mean, like I'm Jewish, so I knew not to vote for the Nazi. I mean, there is that. But beside that, right, it was also this other stuff. And so we couldn't be smug about the fact that we knew not to vote for him. We had to realize that they had been tricked by the marketing of the culture. Marketing works, doesn't it? Marketing works. That's why companies spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year to sell you stuff, right? It's not just because they have an extra pile of cash and nothing to do with it, right? They make commercials because they know that if you see enough of their commercials, you'll buy their product. In fact, there's research which says that about 12 advertisements is all it takes for a particular product for a significant increase in the likelihood that you'll purchase that product. It's called the rule of 12 in marketing and advertising. And it's been shown through all kinds of research that 10, 11 ads, nah, not very likely. All of a sudden that 12th ad is like a critical mass in your brain, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I gotta have Charmin. I've been using Angel Soft for years. What was I thinking? It's not angelic. It's not soft. In fact, I've been chafing myself. I only now realized it. Oh God, what am I doing? Crest toothpaste, my God, that's awful. I've used it for years. I'm switching to Close-Up or something, right? So this is how it works. It doesn't work for everybody, but it works for enough people. That's why the grocery stores put the chocolate at the checkout. Now, that's not a coincidence, right? Not like because notice, grocery stores have a candy aisle, right? They have a whole aisle where there's candy. It's not like they just ordered too much and they were like, oh, damn. What are we gonna do with this extra stuff? I don't know. What should we do with it? Should we put it in the back? Oh no, let's put it where they pay. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, that's a coincidence. No, it's based on the realization that impulse purchasing works and marketing works. Well, if you can be convinced to buy chocolate at the grocery, or People magazine, or switch brands of toilet paper, or go get Taco Bell at 1 in the morning, ever, because you've seen some ad for it, right? And we know it happens. If that can happen with consumer goods, how much easier do you think it might be to convince you of a racial stereotype, or a gender stereotype, or a sexual stereotype, or a religious or a class stereotype? Because we've seen that advertisement, figuratively speaking, a lot more than 12 times. Right? We've been hearing that advertisement, we've been having that beat into our brains since we were children, so much so that I can do trainings with people and ask them, you know, just take out a piece of paper and a pen. I just want you to write down all the stereotypes you can think of about Asian folks, or about Latino folks, or about indigenous peoples, or about gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender folks, or about whatever, right? Just any group. And I've never once had somebody look at me puzzled and confused and unable to complete the assignment. Like, I'm not asking them to acknowledge that they believe any of these, and they're all very quick to say they don't, right? But I've never had anyone go, I don't know, I'm stumped. What do you mean stereotypes about gay folks? I don't know any, my God. Stereotypes about black people? What? No. I've never heard of such a thing. They all know, and they can sit there and write a whole list of them, right? And the reason that's important is that research has found our awareness of those stereotypes makes it very easy for those stereotypes to be triggered in us, even if we don't consciously believe in them and actually think about them that we believe in them. They can be triggered subconsciously. So the fact that we've been marketed, if you will, that we've been conditioned to accept certain things as true means that we are all susceptible to the Dukeism, if not actually David Duke. Because if we don't have a sociological context to explain the disparities, we're going to default to racism as an explanation. We're not going to be able to understand, for instance, that the typical white family in America has 20 times the net worth of the typical black family, 18 times that of the typical Latino family, if we don't understand the history by which some were allowed to accumulate wealth and others were unable to accumulate wealth. It's like an 8-lap head start where certain people had a 8-lap race where certain people had a 5-lap head start. If I had a 5-lap head start on you, I'm supposed to cross the finish line first, Jack. That's how that works, right? But if I started out 5 laps ahead and at the end of the race I'm only 4 laps ahead, I'm actually the slower runner. The person who closed the gap is the faster runner, but we live in a winner-take-all society where all we look at is the end of the game. Who's got the better resume? Who's got the higher test score? Who's got more money in the bank to be able to afford this house versus that apartment? We're looking at the end result of an 8-lap race, in effect, not paying any attention to the first 5 laps unless we've been given a sociological imagination with which to actually explore those issues. But kids don't get born with that imagination. We have to give it to them, right? Otherwise, I look around, there's this research that came out about 5 weeks ago, found that roughly 500 white people in this country have the same collective net worth as all 41 million black folks in this country combined. 500 white people, the same cumulative net worth as 41 million black people. Now here is my challenge to you. If you actually believe that there are 500 white people who collectively have worked harder than 41 million black people, or somehow collectively have a cumulative IQ that much higher than the cumulative IQ of 41 million black people, you should do 2 things. Number 1, you should stand up, walk out, and leave this lecture because there's nothing I can do for you. And then secondly, you should withdraw from this college tomorrow because there's nothing that education can do for you. You are a lost cause if you're even capable of believing that. I don't mean to be harsh, but now that takes a profound degree of stupidity to believe, and yet I gather that some people do believe it. Because otherwise, why would we not be screaming at that when it's released? Why would we not be saying, oh my God, how can that be? Well, because we've internalized the notion that the 500 just must be that smart. They just must work that hard. How the hell can you work that much harder than 41 million people? They're only 24 hours in a damn day. What do these people have their own personal wormhole that they crawl into where time stands still and then they shoot back out the other end of the wormhole where time has not moved at all, right? Do they just do cocaine around the clock and not sleep? How do these people do this, right? It's ridiculous. It's like the Oxfam report that came out 4 weeks ago, right, which found that on a global level, it's even worse. 85 people on this planet have the same cumulative net worth as the poorest 3.5 billion people on this planet. 85 people owning as much collectively as the poorest 1/2 of the world's population. Again, if you think 85 people are just that much smarter, that much harder working than 3.5 billion people, leave, please, for the love of God, drop out. There is nothing that education can do for you. Just go get a job on Wall Street, wreck the economy, whatever it is you want to do, but just do not believe or pretend for a second that college is for you, because it is not. I'm just saying. But if kids don't understand the sociological context, it wouldn't be surprising that they might actually believe that there's just something wrong with those 41 million or those 3.5 billion, something really special about the 85 or the 500, right? They wouldn't be able to understand why it is that black and Latino folks are 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated for a drug offense than white folks. Even though the rates of drug use, drug possession, and even drug dealing are essentially identical across racial lines, contrary to popular belief, it is not people of color more likely to have, use, possess, or deal drugs. I can tell you this not just from the data, though the data does indeed prove it. I can tell you this from personal experience, and I can admit it to you now because the statute of limitations has expired. If the war on drugs were about drugs, I do not know for certain who would be giving you this lecture tonight. But I am quite certain it would not be me, unless prison allows Skyping for lectures at this college, because I would still be locked up, no doubt. And I'm not saying that to brag about drug use. I just say no, just say no. I'm just reminiscing. I got asthma now. I can't do that. I don't recommend it. But anyway, I'm just saying, right, this is not about drug use, it's about the way that our criminal justice resources have been focused on some users and not others. But if your kid doesn't know that, if you don't know that, you see certain people being arrested on the news, right? You see or hear about that data, maybe it just comes around in your brain at some point you hear it. And if you haven't been given a sociological imagination, you conclude what? Well, the people going to jail, they're the bad guys. And the people that aren't going to jail, they're the good guys, right? And so it's easy to come to that if you've been given that myth of meritocracy and individual effort and individualism. And by the same token, when you go out and do community service and service learning projects on a college campus, which I gather is a big thing here, and it is in many schools, you have to really ask yourself, if you don't have the proper sociological imagination to think about the problems that you're out there supposedly to help with, right? What do you think maybe subconsciously the default position might be in your own mind, right? If you've been led to believe that the deficit is in the community that you're there to help, that they're the ones with the problem, that they're the ones with the flaw, no matter how compassionate you may think you're being, no matter how caring you think you are, and no matter how caring and compassionate you actually might very well be, you're actually capable of doing quite a bit more damage and harm to that community than you are any benefit. Because if you go in with the idea that the reason they're in need is because of some lack in them, you will treat them in a colonial fashion as inferiors. And the best thing that will happen is some charitable impulse, which does nothing to change the society. If service learning and community service is based on a model of charity, it is worth nothing. It should be abolished. If community service and service learning is based on the notion of solidarity and on the basis of altering the social conditions that make the service necessary, then I'm all for that. And that's exactly what institutions like this ought to be working on, is trying not simply to patch up the damage, but to end the creation of damage. Right? And too oftentimes we don't do that because we've got the mentality that they're the problem, so we just got to fix them. They're not the problem. A system that creates poverty, a system that creates inequality, by definition, is the problem. So our goal has to be to have that sociological imagination, because even the best intended of us, if we don't have it, and if we're not clear on how certain conditions come to be, whether it's economic or racial or anything else, right, then it's very easy for us to go out there with this sort of missionary mindset, this messianic mindset, and actually be surprised that nothing ever changes. Well, of course it won't, because charity typically doesn't change much in the long run. Keeping in mind, by the way, that the problem with charity is even deeper than that. If you think about it, what do most people say if you ask them if they would accept charity? No. Most people say no. Most people say they're too proud. Most people say they would never want to accept charity, but yet they'll give it. I want you to think about what that means. Right? I want you to think about what it signifies. If I'm willing to give you charity, but I would never accept it myself because I'm too proud, what I've just done is inferiorize you. What I've just done is say that you are beneath me, that you don't even have the same pride of self that I have, that you are somehow an inferior, a benighted soul. But here, have a little bread. Here, have a little soup. Here, I'll help you build a house. Here, I'll do this for you and that for you. But if I actually wouldn't even accept it myself, then my mentality is not where it needs to be to alter those conditions that created that situation. And so we have to make sure that before we go out there and while we're out there doing service work, and I'm not against service work, please don't misunderstand. I just want it to have the intentionality and the purposefulness that is required to change the structures that make those kinds of programs needed in the first place. They shouldn't happen. They shouldn't have to happen. We ought not have a housing shortage in the wealthiest nation on earth. We ought not have to have soup kitchens to feed people in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. But we do, because we have a system that produces beggars, and a system that produces paupers, and a system that produces inequality, not on accident, but as a matter of its normal operating procedure. It always has. It's not really accidental in the sense that poverty and unemployment are actually built into the system, and always have been built into the system, so much so that if unemployment drops too much, the stock market takes a dive, right? It's true, you know that, right? Like when the stock market goes up, it's almost always because people got laid off, right? So if people get laid off, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, lives destroyed, but rich people make a lot of money, right? Because it made the company leaner and meaner, and that's good for the shareholders, not so much for the workers, but it's very good for the shareholders. So in fact, there's an inherent tension, isn't there, between the needs of the wealthiest 1 to, let's say, half of 1%, 1/10 of 1%, the rest of us, right? But we don't ever talk about that. And we don't think about that when we're doing our service projects, a system that creates those types of inequalities, but we should. Which brings me then to the next lesson that I've learned in that 20 to 25 years, which is that if we're going to identify a problem when it comes to race in the modern era, I think colorblindness would have to be it. color blindness would have to be the biggest impediment to racial equity. And that may seem counterintuitive to some because we've been led to believe, haven't we, that that's the goal, that that's the thing to which we should aspire, right? People will say that. They'll even quote Dr. King entirely out of context from a speech they never heard the whole text of. Right? The I Have a Dream speech, which wasn't even called that, by the way, until after the fact. Right? They'll quote that one line, oh, we should judge people on the basis of the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So see, Dr. King believed in colorblindness. Nonsense. Dr. King also said in that speech that white America had bounced a check to black people and that they had come to cash it and to give it back because it was marked insufficient funds. He was very clear where the check came from and who had written it. And he was very clear who had the money and who didn't have the money. And he didn't pull any punches on that. When he wrote that letter from the Birmingham jail and identified those white moderates, he called them white moderate ministers. He didn't just say moderate ministers of an indeterminate color. He said white. If he were colorblind, he wouldn't have done that. Dr. King was very clear about the importance of being color conscious because, as Julian Bond, one of his contemporaries in civil rights legend, says, to be blind to color is to be blind to the consequences of color. And if color still has consequences, you have to acknowledge what those are and what brings them about, or you can't possibly solve them. You cannot understand racial inequality with color blindness. In fact, you'll default to an oftentimes racist explanation for the inequities, as I just said a second ago. But you definitely can't solve the problem if you're not aware of what it is that is bringing it about. And importantly, you can't even examine how your own identity shapes your perception. It's not just that you can't understand the other, that's obvious, but you can't even understand the self. If you saw the film White Like Me, I know they showed it last week, you know that there's a whole section in there on subconscious bias. I won't go over all of it with you, but I'll just, for those who didn't see the movie and even for those who did, I just want to review it for a second. One of the things that makes colorblindness dangerous is it keeps us from examining how our own color shapes our perceptions and how our own color interacts with social phenomena to produce various prejudices and biases, not necessarily conscious ones, not necessarily overt or intentional ones, right? So what we know, for example, is that about 10, 15, even 20 years of research now has found that even people who are not overtly racist in any sense of the word, overtly biased or bigoted in any sense, oftentimes internalize these subconscious or unconscious biases that can be triggered in certain situations. They won't always be triggered. They won't necessarily lead to discriminatory action, but they can. And what that research has found is that about 75% roughly of white folks have internalized anti-black bias, and about 2/3 of Asian and Latino folks have also internalized anti-black bias, and about 45% of black folks have internalized anti-black bias against themselves. There's also some data to suggest that it is a growing problem of internalized bias against Asian Americans, against Latino Americans, obviously because of increased immigration, against our Muslim brothers and sisters and Arab American brothers and sisters post 9/11. So this is a problem that cuts across racial lines. Everybody's sort of internalizing this stuff once again because marketing and messaging works. There was a study a few years ago which took white folks who were not overtly biased, hooked us up to brain scan imaging machines. These were all white folks who had taken a pre-test and had passed with flying colors. No overt racism in any of them, right? All very liberal and open-minded for what that was worth. They hooked them up to brain scan machines and started flashing images on a screen. But they flashed the images so fast that the conscious mind didn't even have time to know what it saw, right? 85 milliseconds or something, 200 milliseconds, I don't know, whatever it was, way too fast for you to even realize what you'd seen, right? And most of the images were pretty innocuous. Blade of grass, ice cream cone, puppy dog, rabbit, whatever. And there wasn't a whole lot of brain activity, wasn't a lot of response, right? Then they flashed an image of a black male face on the screen for 85 milliseconds or whatever. And the part of the brain that responds to fear and anxiety and stress lit up like a Christmas tree in about 90% of the participants. And then as soon as that image was gone and it was replaced with other innocuous images, that effect went away. In other words, the only image that produced this particular sort of fight or flight reaction, right, was the image of a black male face. And this was in a nice, controlled, air-conditioned environment with cushy seats. And it was white liberals, right, who were having that reaction. These weren't people that carry around overt hatred. These are not like reactionary, hateful people. These are people that are relatively liberal and open-minded, and yet they still have internalized those same biases. In that moment, they can be turned into Michael Dunn without the gun, and George Zimmerman without the gun, right? And if that can happen in a lab experiment, right, that's so easy and cushy and comfortable, think about how much easier it is to trigger that out there in the real world. Whether you're a law enforcement officer or a teacher in a classroom who gets challenged by a kid and overreacts to the disrespect that they see from that child but not that child, right? Because we know that actually the data tells us that white children in schools are just as likely to break the rules that can lead to suspension and expulsion as black kids are. But as black kids and Latino kids, increasingly 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, right? And usually not for serious infractions like weapons or drugs or fighting. Usually it's for subjective infractions, like disrespecting authority, which is an inherently subjective thing. Because what I view as a disrespect to my authority can be culturally conditioned on what I'm afraid of, what I fear, what I resent, what I'm anxious about, right? So even people who are not overtly biased, according to this research, can, in certain situations, have those biases triggered. Doesn't mean they'll act on them every time, but that ought to scare you into realizing that it's us. Again, it's us. This isn't about good people over here, bad people over here. This isn't about liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans and all this other nonsense. This is about people living in a society where we've all been hit with this stuff. And we've all been, in many ways, suckered by it. There was a study that just came out in December that sort of confirms how this operates, just to give you an idea of a recent study on this. There was a study similar to it 10 years ago you may have heard of. This is a new one that you probably haven't heard of. 10 years ago, the study that you probably did hear about was one where the researchers sent out about 5,000 resumes to about 1,250 different employers in 3 large urban areas. And they sent out half the resumes with quote-unquote black names, half the resumes with quote-unquote white names, to see what the effect would be of perceived blackness versus perceived whiteness, even when the qualifications were the same. So even when the qualifications were essentially interchangeable and identical, those with white-sounding names were 50% more likely to get called back for an interview than those with black-sounding names. Now, I thought that was a pretty impressive and meaningful study. A lot of other people did too. Some people criticized it for being methodologically problematic, and they brought up all types of objections. So, fine, here's a new one. And this is a study that was methodologically much tighter because it was a bigger study, first of all, 10,000 resumes in multiple, like I think a dozen large metropolitan areas around the country. And it was very narrowly focused in one particular area or industry, banking, finance, and accounting type jobs, which is important because the other study had been broader, and one of the criticisms was, well, a lot of these are entry-level jobs and there's different skill level jobs, and so it might be hard to tease out the effects of that. Okay, fine, these folks said, forget it. We'll just look at finance, banking, accounting, jobs where there are very specific kinds of qualifications and experiences that one would probably need to have in order to be qualified. So they did half the names white, half the names black. They sent them out, and they made sure, this was another tweak that they did, they made sure that some of the resumes had maximum qualifications. So the 3 areas they were looking at was, do you have prior experience, job experience in that field? Do you have a prior internship in that field? And was your college degree in that field? In other words, those are the 3 areas. And some of the applicants, white and black, had all 3 of those. So they were maximally qualified. Others had 2 of them but not 1, 1 but not 2, and some had none. Right? Some of them had never worked in banking, accounting, or finance. Some of them had no internship, and some of them had English lit degrees, right? But wanted to go into banking for whatever reason. And so they made sure that they could jiggle both the names and also the qualifications just to see what would happen. Now, it won't surprise you that overall there was a slight edge for white folks. It wasn't huge, it was only about 15%, so you might say, oh, things are getting better. Well, the problem is that the reason it was that small in the aggregate was because there was virtually no difference at the lowest level. Like at the lowest level, if you were totally unqualified in white or totally unqualified in black, you were pretty equally likely not to get a shot. And that was a lot of the applicants. So that's where there was very little difference. But when you went up the scale, this is what was fascinating. When you go up the scale to the folks who were the most qualified, right? The African American folks who had an internship, had job experience in the field, had a field-specific college degree, and compared them to the white folks who had a field-specific degree, job experience, and an internship in the field, that's where the differences got huge. Yes, everybody's odds went up as the qualifications went up, but black folks' odds went up like this, white folks' odds went up like this. In other words, white folks were getting more payback for their investment. There was more of a payback for their investment. They had about a 50 to 60% better chance of getting a call back when the qualifications were A, equal, and B, maximum, right? And in fact, what was frightening was African Americans who had the maximum qualifications had no better chance of a callback than white folks with none of the qualifications. So white folks who didn't have any experience or specific education or internship were just as likely to get called back as black folks who had all of those things. Now, what is that? Is that about these employers being overt bigots, Klansmen, David Duke supporters? I doubt it, right? But what I don't doubt is that the implicit subconscious bias research is probably what explains this, right? That these folks are looking at resumes and something's happening. They're seeing that name that they view as stereotypically black, and all of a sudden it's like they can't read the page, right? It's like they can't see the qualifications that are right in front of them because their mind starts to shut off because now all these subconscious things are being triggered. And if it's somebody with a white name, they can see it. They're not bad people, right? These are not bigots. They're not bad people. But they're people who are making decisions based on some internalized stuff in all likelihood that we ought to be concerned about. And the problem is, of course, the law can't get at that. The law doesn't make that illegal, right? Because if they hire someone who is qualified, and these white folks with the qualifications they're hiring are qualified, it's just that they're not giving the same shot to black folks with those qualifications. And that's not illegal. There's really no way to sue for that. So ultimately, that implicit bias can continue to wreak havoc on the opportunity structure, and we ought to be concerned about that. The next lesson I've learned is that good intentions don't matter. And, you know, I know, again, that seems counterintuitive, because we really are invested in our good intentions, aren't we? We're very desirous of being thought of as good people who mean well. And I think for the most part, we can just stipulate, I will certainly stipulate, I think most people are good folks who mean well. I really do. I think most people are pretty good folks. I think this is the good news tonight. Like, if you're sort of shook up with the bad news, here's the good news. Tim Wise says most people not sociopaths. So write that down. That's good news. But the problem is that good people can often miss bad systems. Right? In fact, I would say sometimes it's even easier for good people to miss bad systems, because good people don't want to look at the ugly. Right? Good people are so upset by the ugly, they don't want to see it. Sociopaths don't mind it, so they see it, right? That's the beauty of being a sociopath. You're like, oh, you're in pain? Cool, I like pain. That's what I do. I'm a sociopath. Sociopath will tell you everything wrong with the society because they love it, right? But a good person who wants to do good things would be the kind of person that doesn't want to see it. They run from it. We don't want to talk about it many times. And I'll tell you how I know this works. Again, it's not from just research. It's also from personal experience. When I was in 5th grade, I had an interesting encounter with a teacher at my school. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and first, before I explain the story, I should tell you that I went to preschool at Tennessee State University, which is a historically black college in Nashville. I was one of only about 3 white kids in a preschool class of 20. So I grew up in a very different educational, early childhood ed context than most white kids. And so as a result of that, the first 5 years of regular school, once I started school, pretty much all my friends were black. And I'm not saying that just like I know all white people say they have black friends. And we're almost always lying. But in this case, like, that was all I had. Like, seriously, that's who I hung out with, that's who I played ball with, that's who I sat in the lunchroom with. And there was one teacher in particular who had a real problem with that. She'd been teaching in the school system for far too long, since before integration had really happened, keeping in mind now that even though the Brown versus Board of Education decision was handed down in 1954, most school systems affected by it didn't really fully begin to truly desegregate until 20 years later. It was 1974 when that finally actually filtered down to the schools in Nashville. That happened in the year that I started 1st grade. So by 5th grade, I'm sitting in this classroom, and this teacher who'd been teaching since well before 1974 and didn't really like the demographic shift in the schools, didn't like having to teach black kids, and really didn't like, apparently, white kids who hung out with black kids, decided that she was going to give me a D in a reading class. My mother was a bit confused by this because she knew I could read and read quite well. I've been reading since I was 2 and a half. So she was a little freaked out by that. She's like, wait a minute, now I know he can read. If it was math, I'd totally believe he got it. But reading, no, he should have gotten an A in that. So she went up to find out what was going on. She sat down with the teacher, and the teacher made it very clear in a very short period of time that my grade had very little to do with my actual work or ability, that it had everything to do with my social circle. She looked at my mother and said, you know, any white parent who would send their child to public school in this day and age, meaning the era of integration, clearly needs to have their head checked. They're not fit to be a parent. This was not the best professional move for this particular teacher. Because my mother, who doesn't suffer fools gladly or at all, then marched down to the principal's office and told the principal she had approximately 72 hours to fire this individual, or there was going to be hell to pay. So we came back on Monday, and Mrs. Crownover had been unceremoniously retired. So fantastic, wonderful. My mother's great. She's a saint. She got rid of the racist. Excellent. Very true, all of it. But here's the problem. When I went back to that class on Monday, Miss Crownover wasn't there. This bigot had been removed. The good intentions of my mother had triumphed. But I went back into a class, which I think I forgot to tell you was an honors class. And it was a class where there was only one black child, one black female, no black males, no other people of color, right? So in a weird way, because of tracking, putting the white kids in the advanced level class, whether we were good students or not, putting the black kids in the lower level classes, whether they were good students or not, in a weird way, that school system was teaching me the lesson Miss Crownover was trying to teach. Right? We didn't need Miss Crownover to tell us who was good and who was bad, who was superior and who was inferior. The school system was doing that, and my mama didn't see that. And I didn't see that until many years later. You see, good intentions can blind you to bad systems, and that's not just a 1978 and 79 story. That tracking continues to go on. White students 2 to 3 times more likely today to be in advanced level honors or AP classes than students of color. Than students of color. Students of color half as likely in many states. There are hundreds of schools that don't even have AP and honors classes. They're disproportionately in black and brown communities or poor white communities too. There also is a class element to this, obviously. Right? So that was something that we missed despite our good intentions, right? So good intentions are not enough, and good intentions don't prevent us from receiving unearned advantage, right? So it's not just that people of color are 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated for a drug offense, and those of us who are white and did the same crimes far less likely to be. It's that we're not being racially profiled, we're not being subjected to the psychological trauma of being thought of as a problem in need of a solution. So when I was 23, I remember living in New Orleans. I graduated from Tulane the year before. And one afternoon, I was supposed to go pick up my girlfriend. She was finishing up her senior year at Tulane, so we're going to go to lunch. And I was using her car, and I locked myself out. So I had like 5 minutes to get up there, right? And I'm freaking out. I'm like, oh man, I'm going to be late. So I run in the house to get a coat hanger, right? Because that's back in the, I don't know how it is now. Like now they got locks that you can't do this with. But back in the old days, you just had a little thing and it just popped up, right? Some cars are still like that, but you know. But anyway, so I had this coat hanger. I'm like, I know I can get in. Because I worked at a grocery, sacking groceries when I was 16, and little old ladies would sometimes lock themselves out, and they'd be like, can you get into my car? And I'm, yes, I can. And then they would tip me, so I got really good at it. So I figured, I got this, no problem. So I come out with the coat hanger, and I start working on this window, trying to go through the window down and hook it and pull it, and I can't. 10 minutes in, I still haven't been able to get. I'm getting angry, too, because I'm late, and I can't figure out why. I cannot figure out why the 1988 Toyota Tercel is the hardest single vehicle in the history of the automobile to break into. And I really couldn't understand it because the 1988 Toyota Tercel is also the least desirable vehicle in the history of the automobile. No one would ever want it. Why would they make it so foolproof? I couldn't get in, but then all of a sudden a white New Orleans police officer comes up, hops out of his car, sees me trying to break into a car. Now, I think you can probably assume what would be a logical thing for a police officer coming upon someone trying to break into a vehicle. What would you ask that person? I would think you might ask them for some identification. You might ask them for some proof that this actually was their car. You just might even ask them, is that your car? Like just something simple, right? He did none of these things. No asking of identification, no asking as to whether or not I had the right to break into this thing. He just said, what's going on? And I said, well, I locked myself out of my girlfriend's car. I need to go pick her up at Tulane. I've been trying for 10 minutes. I can't get in. And he looked at me and he said, oh, well, I can tell you this much. You're doing that wrong. Really? I'm breaking into a car the wrong way, and you, the officer of the law, are going to teach me the right way. Awesome. So he goes to his trunk, he pulls out a Slim Jim, this long metal rod they use to break into cars when they're needing to break into cars as cops. And just a tool of the trade in New Orleans. And he tries to go at the door the same way I did, and he too couldn't get in. It's amazing. Amazing, the automotive supremacy of the 1988 Toyota. So he's getting frustrated. He tries it. Now he's really pissed, in fact, because he was going to be a big bad lawman and show me how to break in. Now he can't. Now he's sort of embarrassed. He says, we should just get a rock and throw it through the window. I'm like, what? It's like, yeah, it'll be fun. It's like, fun? My girlfriend is going to kill me. He's like, don't worry about it. We'll just tell her somebody tried to break in. I'm like, yeah, somebody did. You. He was totally serious, right? He ended up giving me a ride up to Tulane. I mean, couldn't have been more helpful. Now, if you think that a 23-year-old black male in New Orleans or any other place in this country in 1991 or today would have been approached by that officer and never asked to prove that he had a right to be in that car, never asked for any identification at all, then this lecture's clearly lost on you. I'm sorry to have wasted your hour because, there's nothing that you can learn. Clearly, it's obvious that that's a totally different thing. And my good intentions, I was already an activist by then. I was already doing anti-racism work. But my good intentions didn't keep me from getting that privilege. It didn't keep me from being looked at differently and treated better. That's going to happen until that system changes. So good intentions, in other words, simply not enough. And this is very important because, again, I think that for the most part, the employers who perpetuate racial inequality on the job are not necessarily bad people. Like if you look at the recent study that came out last year, it was talked about in the New York Times a year ago this month actually, found that about 45% of all the new jobs in the economy are filled not through open competitions where we send in our resumes and the best person gets the gig, right? That about 45% of the new jobs are filled by way of letters of recommendation written by people who already work for the company on behalf of the applicant who wants to work there. Now again, in theory, that's race neutral. That's not like a racial thing necessarily. But who do you think the people are who disproportionately find themselves connected to Jim over in accounting or Mary over in the HR department, right? Ultimately, what the study found was that disproportionately, not only, but disproportionately, the folks who have access to those internal networks are more likely to be white, far more likely to be male, far more likely to be affluent, and have gone to the quote-unquote right schools, which means that we're all sort of screwed potentially, right? Because seriously, like you could be a person of color, you could be a woman of any color, you could be a working class white dude, right? And you could be the most qualified person for the gig, but they won't even know about you. And you won't even know about them. And if you don't know about the job and they don't know about you, then you can't be matched up. Right? It's like that's not even 5 laps back in an 8-lap race. That's like not even knowing there is a race. You don't even know where the track is at, right? Is there a race going on? I didn't know there was a race. And the race is done and somebody else got it because Jim in accounting is their buddy. Now, the employers who do this will never say that it's about racism or sexism or classism, and in an overt sense it's not. You know what they'll tell you, and I think they're being honest, they'll say, well, it's just cheaper, it cuts down our job search, it's easier for us. I know that's true. And it probably, to be honest, isn't a catastrophic policy for them because the odds are, if Jim over in accounting is working out okay, you can probably take it for granted that whoever he recommends is not going to be a total train wreck, right? He's probably going to have some reasonably good recommendations, so you can take the risk, right? And probably end up with decent employees. But the problem is, unless you think Jim just so happens to know the next best qualified person for that job, and what are the mathematical odds of that? That employee A, who got hired last year, just so happens to know and play golf with the very next most qualified person out of 310 million people in the United States. I would say that's pretty unlikely, right? But ultimately, that kind of system, if we're having roughly half the jobs filled that way, means basically half of us are scratched from the start. Right? We have half as many opportunities to receive one of those jobs. It has nothing to do with merit, nothing to do with ambition, nothing to do with work ethic or qualifications, everything to do with systems of inequality. That's why right now, African Americans with college degrees twice as likely as whites with degrees to be out of work. Latinos with degrees, 50% more likely than whites with degrees to be out of work. Asian Americans with degrees, 28% more likely than whites with degrees to be out of work. It's not necessarily because of overt racism, but it's because even when those people of color have obtained the qualifications, right? Even when they've gone to college, received their degree, done all of that stuff that's supposed to put you in the race, at an equal level, they're still not connected to the same networks. And so that's what we have to talk about. We have to understand that racism is that. That may not seem like racism if we've been led to believe that racism is fire hoses in the streets of Birmingham and people being beaten on the Evelyn Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965. The bombing of the Birmingham church in 1963, but if we understand racism as this much broader, much more capacious, much more systemic thing, a process by which racial disparity is maintained with or without evil intention, then we're on to something. Final lesson, and then I'll take questions. All of us have lenses that shape how we see this country and this world when it comes to race and other identity markers. We don't like to sometimes admit that. We like to think that we're objective and that we see things clearly. But the reality is we don't. And identity is one of the reasons. Our identity shapes our experiences and shapes our perceptions in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I think of the movie The Matrix when I think about this. Right, so if you remember in the film The Matrix, Neo is offered 2 pills, right, to take. One, if he takes it, is blue. If he takes it, he gets to remain oblivious to the workings of the world. He remains, in effect, asleep in a dream state like the movie says we all are, not knowing the actual way in which the society is operating in the background, right? The other pill that he is offered is a red pill, and if he takes the red pill, he will receive enlightenment, and he will begin to see the things that are happening in the background and understand the workings of the system and the society. Of course, Neo takes the red pill, but in many ways, I think in this society, it seems to me that members of the dominant group, whatever that is, so racially it's whites, gender, in terms of gender it's men, in terms of class it's wealthy folks, in terms of sexuality it's straight and cisgender people, in terms of physical ability or disability it's the able-bodied, etc. That when you're a member of a dominant group, it's like you're just taking the blue pill and staying asleep because you can. You never have to take the red pill. In fact, you really don't want to, right? You'd really rather take the blue pill and just remain oblivious, because you can remain oblivious. You have that luxury. Now, the target groups don't have that luxury. Not saying that none of them are oblivious. There are people of color who are oblivious to racism. There are women who are oblivious to sexism. But by and large, members of the target group know a little something about these things because they've been taking the red pill, at least a little bit, if not a lot, because they had no choice. They had to understand the world in order to survive the world. And so when you're taking the red pill, you see certain things. It gives you one set of lenses. When you're taking the blue pill, you got a different set of lenses. You don't even know you got lenses. If Neo had taken the blue pill, A, the movie would have ended really quickly. But more importantly, he wouldn't have even known he had lenses, right? Nobody would have understood that. Nobody, that's the whole point of the movie, is the people who were asleep don't know they're asleep. They think everything's normal, right? And to some extent, that's what this is. Privilege allows you to be oblivious. When you're the dominant group, you don't have to know stuff. And when you don't have to know stuff, the odds are you won't know stuff. Like, I'm oblivious to calculus. You know why? Because I never took it. You know why? Because I didn't want to, and the school system I attended did not make me, right? And this is not meant as a critique of calculus teachers or those who are students and who love calculus. I'm sure it is a fine discipline. Somebody must teach it. Others must learn it. I just knew it wasn't going to be me. So I avoided it, and I was allowed to avoid it. And as a result of being allowed to avoid it, I know nothing of it. So if I were to stand up here and start pontificating about calculus, you would think I'd lost my mind. With good reason, because I know nothing about it. And yet, oddly enough, white folks think that we're qualified to get up and talk about race and tell people of color what their reality is, and we've never taken the damn class. Men think we're qualified to tell women what their reality is, and we've never taken the class. Straight and cisgendered folks think that we're qualified to tell LGBT folks about their reality, and we've never taken the class. You see? So if I were to tell, like, I did not go to learn how to be a plumber. So if I come to snake your toilet, you need to call somebody else. You would call someone who had actually known something about that. But like with social reality, we just act like, oh, it doesn't matter that we've never had to learn this stuff. And as a result of never having had to learn it, we haven't known it. Not just now, but even 50 years ago. Go back to the early 60s, 1963 Gallup poll, right? If you saw the film, you saw the statistic. Gallup went around and asked white folks, do you think that racial minorities are treated equally in terms of education, housing, and employment? They asked this in 1963, a year before the Civil Rights Act was even passed. So we know what the answer is. The answer is no, right? In retrospect, a half a century in the rearview mirror, it doesn't take any courage or real insight to know that the answer is no. But in 1963, when the past wasn't the past, when it was the present, and Gallup asked white people that question, 2 out of 3 of us said, oh yeah, they're treated fully equally. Everything's fine in America. In 1962, they asked, do you think black children have just as good a chance as white children to get a good education? Again, come on, 1962, in retrospect, we know the answer was no. But in 1962, when the question was asked, 85 out of 100 white people said yes. 85% of white Americans thought, sure, educational opportunity fully equal. Now, we can look back at that and realize that that's like borderline delusional, right? But here's the really scary part. Those weren't bad people. By and large, they weren't stupid people. They were functional human beings. They were capable of putting one foot in front of the other, brushing their teeth in the morning, changing the cat pan, walking the dog, getting the kids off to school, right? Washing their hands after they use the restroom. I mean, all these things that people do, they're able to be functional, and stupid people can't keep power for that long, so they ain't stupid. Right? So the reality was, these folks who didn't know any better, there has to be an explanation. The only one I can come up with is that their obliviousness was essentially subsidized by the culture. They didn't have to know any better. There was no penalty, was there? I mean, like, you could be totally stupid about other people's reality, totally ignorant about their reality, totally oblivious to their reality. And if the people about whom you were oblivious were people of color, there was not going to be any punishment, no consequence, because that stuff wasn't going to be on the test, was it? And by that, I mean whatever test you got to take to graduate from school, get into college, grad school, law school, med school, get a professional certification for any job you might want. No matter what it is you want to do, you wouldn't have to prove that you knew anything about black and brown reality. So there'd be no consequence, so you could remain oblivious, just like I could remain oblivious to calculus and it didn't matter, right? Didn't really matter in the larger scheme of things. Now, people of color don't have that luxury. They don't get to be oblivious to what white folks think is important, because that's going to be on the test, right? That's going to be the whole test. Whatever it is that's on the test, whatever the test is, you can bet that that's something some white folks thought was important knowledge. And important enough that if you didn't know it, you weren't competent to do whatever it is you were trying to do. So people of color have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know, we don't call it that. That is the point, right? When your stuff is considered normative, you don't have to racially designate where it came from. You don't have to call it white literature, do you? You get to call it literature. Theater. Poetry. Art. For those who are confused, we're almost out of the month, but it is still February. This is why we don't have White History Month. Because we have several. They just go by these tricky names that we gave them, so nobody would know what we were doing. Names like May and June, July and August. Right? If it's a month that hasn't been designated for somebody else, you can bet that's going to be ours. Right? We don't have to think about that. We don't have to think about the normativity and the normalcy of the white narrative. This is what Molefi Asante and Temple calls the hallmark of Eurocentric thought, right? Is this idea of universalizing the particular, taking that which is particular to you and presuming that it is universal and true for everyone, right? And that's the hallmark of Eurocentric thought. And so in this particular case, right, people of color have to see some things that white folks don't have to see. Same thing is true with gender, right? There are things that men don't have to know about the treatment of women that women have to know as a matter of survival. And if men don't know it, it doesn't make us bad people. It just means that we've been essentially subsidized to remain oblivious. No punishment ensues. We don't have to know, right? And we can come up with all kinds of excuses for women, right? In terms of why things go well, they're just over emotional, overwrought, maybe hormonal, because, you know, only women have hormones, apparently. Testosterone does nothing to us. Estrogen, oh, well, that will jack you up. So men don't have to know any better. Straight and cisgendered folks don't have to know what our LGBT brothers and sisters experience in terms of straight supremacy, cis supremacy, transphobia. And if we do know anything about it, it's probably just because somebody in the LGBT community told us and we chose to actually listen to them and assume that they knew their reality better than we knew their reality. Shocking, radical concept that is. Same thing with ability or disability. Those of us who are able-bodied, and I should say that temporarily so, whether it's a visible or an invisible disability, right? If we live long enough, the odds are we're all going to have one, right? Those of us who are temporarily able-bodied have the luxury of not thinking about the stuff that people with disabilities got to think about. If it's a physical disability, how they're going to get in and out of a room, how much time it's going to take to get from one side of campus to the next. Is the workspace going to accommodate whatever that disability is? If it's an invisible disability, maybe a learning disability, something along those lines, something you don't necessarily see, right, but which can also impact the opportunity structure. That's the kind of stuff we don't have to think about if we don't have one of those disabilities, but those who have them have to. They have to think about how that's going to affect their education. Will there be accommodation for that different learning style or disability? No, these are real issues. And the fact that able-bodied folks don't think about it doesn't make us bad people. This is not about good people, bad people. This is about all of us mostly being good people, but missing things that we're not required to notice. And that happens on college campuses in the classroom, right? If we're going to make real progress, whether it's here or anywhere else, we have to make sure that these conversations start with the most obvious and yet maybe the most misunderstood point of all, which is that those who are the targets of marginalization and discrimination know a lot more about what's going on in their lives with regard to those issues than those of us who are not the targets do. And so the first side of caution is to begin with the understanding that we have to learn to listen as much as we love to talk, that we have to learn to hear as much as we love to speak, and to tell our truth, that there are these other truths that we need to understand. And please know that if we don't learn them pretty quickly and then get busy on addressing the disparities that come from those problems, we're going to be in really serious trouble. I would say we already are, but we don't have a whole lot of time to figure this out and start getting active to try to change the social reality. In 29 years, maybe less, half of the country's population are going to be people of color, half are going to be white. That's just a fact, and it does not matter what you think about it. It does not matter how you feel about it. It is going to happen. I know there are some folks who don't like it. There's some white folks in Arizona truly pissed about it. It doesn't matter. I've been there. I've seen those white people. Their average age is 137. So, TikTok. And that's not, please do not write that Tim Wise advocated the death of the elderly. I did not. I hope they all live a nice long life. I'm just saying, age is highly correlated with that thing we call death. That's all I'm saying. So the odds are they're not going to win. They might say, I want my country back, but they're not getting it. See, they're just not. Because the future doesn't belong to them, no matter how much they might think it does. And I love these folks, right, just as an aside, like these older folks who were sort of the impetus for the Tea Party stuff, and they're going to these rallies and they're all amped up. I want my country back, and they got their George Washington powdered wigs on and their muskets and their "Don't Tread on Me" flag, and they're calling themselves the Tea Party, and then they have the temerity to tell black people to get over the past. See, when you're wearing powdered wigs and calling yourself the Tea Party, which is a really dated reference, you don't actually get to tell other people to come out of the past. Like, you're still hanging out in 1774, so you first. So that's the point. I guess if we're prepared to usher in multiracial democracy and fight for it, whether it's on a college campus or in a larger community, whether it's in the service learning projects that we do to actually imbue them with a radical and transformative ideology and a mentality, then we can carry the day and we can create multiracial democracy or not. Because, you know, even as the demographics change, that's no guarantee of transformation. White folks held on in South Africa for a very long time and did a lot of damage on the way out the door. And so when it's a 50-50 country, that's a lot more than the South Africa situation. It was 6% white and they held on for a long time. 50% white folks, 50% people of color, but we're not going to survive with the level of inequality we have now. We got to do something about it, or this isn't going to be a sustainable economy for anybody. If we get to that day in 29 years and we have half the population twice as likely as the other half to be unemployed, 3 times as likely to be poor, 1/20th the net worth, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight children, 9 years less life expectancy, how in the world are we going to be a sustainable economy for anyone's children, not just people of color, but white folks as well? See, at the end of the day, the most important thing for you to remember is that the struggle for racial equity is not and has never been an act of charity. It is not about what we will do for others. It is a profound and radical act of self-help upon which we all ultimately depend. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Do some questions. We've got a microphone. We have a microphone that we can get to you if you raise your hand. And I just want to say thank you, folks who have to leave. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you hanging out. We went longer than I expected. If you can just do it with the least amount of volume, then that way the questions and the answers can be heard. First one's right here, and I'm going to come back to you second. Okay? All right. We'll come to you second. We'll start here. Yes.
Hello, my name is Aloysius Kaluba.
Hi.
So oftentimes when I hear arguments about LGBT movements, it's often compared to the civil rights movement. How do you think that compares? Do you think it's comparable to that movement?
Well, I think all social movements have certain similarities and comparable aspects that we should talk about and acknowledge from a strategic perspective, because we can learn from each other. All these movements can learn from one another and build on one another. So that's not only true for the LGBT liberation movement, it's true for the women's movement, it's true for the environmental movement, it's true for the labor movement. All of these have grown and built from one another, and we've learned from each other. I think the danger, right, is that when you compare movements where there are some real similarities, you run the risk of just acting as if everything's exactly the same. And the reality is no two movements are identical, and no two systems of oppression are identical. And it's not necessary to, it's sort of like the way, you know, how everybody, whenever they want to point to some foreign dictator who they're angry at, they're always Hitler. They're always the next Hitler, right? So in other words, it's not enough that Saddam Hussein is just Saddam Hussein and he's killed a lot of people. He has to be the next Hitler. And it's not enough that, you know, whoever, pick another dictator, right, is bad. They have to be the next Hitler. And I think sometimes we just have to deal with problems as they are and realize that it's big enough. The problem of straight supremacy and homophobia and heterosexism are big enough without having to be fully equivalized to white supremacy. They're different systems of oppression. They interlock, they intersect, they cross paths an awful lot, but we don't have to like draw out these analogies as if they were these direct cognates of one another, because in fact, there are lots of similarities, there are some differences. I think the similarities outweigh the differences, because I think ultimately what we're talking about is systems of oppression that have to be overthrown and undone. But I just think that sometimes the analogies can be done in a way that's very sloppy and dangerous. So for instance, after Prop 8 in California, Prop 8 passed, and the reaction from many of the LGBT community, the activists, the white, I should say, LGBT community, because This is another thing. When we talk about the LGBT liberation struggle, it has been racialized as a white thing. It has been classed as an upper middle class thing, which really completely marginalizes LGBT folk of color and working class folks who are totally left out of the movement as if they don't exist. And that's a whole nother problem of internalized white supremacy and classism within that struggle, which also happened in the feminist movement, second wave feminism, etc. But in the wake of Prop 8, what happened was that you had some people like Dan Savage, columnist Dan Savage, who said some really horrific things about how, it was black folks, like he said, we went and voted for Obama, but they wouldn't go and vote against Prop 8, meaning like, we white gay folks went and voted for your guy, and you black folks wouldn't vote for us. As if, first of all, some of those black people aren't also in the us, right? Which is the first problem. Again, there's Dan Savage basically whitening the struggle. And it was incredibly offensive because, in fact, black folks were not to blame for Prop 8 passing. Black folks were a whopping 11 or 12% of the electorate in the state of California. They cannot in and of themselves be the result or the cause of it. And the survey that actually showed them being so disproportionately to blame for it was a survey of like 260 voters. It wasn't even a representative sample. But, the next month, The Advocate magazine, which is sort of the big glossy LGBT magazine on the newsstands, had a big, cover story. It said, "Gay is the new black," right? Once again, like sort of using this idea of sexuality and race being these interchangeable things, and it's an offensive title for a lot of reasons, right? Number one, it diminishes the extent to which black is still the new black and the old black and still has its own issues, right? And it ignores the fact that gay and black also exist together. So it was, again, sort of this whitening of the problem. So I think the problem with the civil rights, using the civil rights language or rhetoric, isn't that there aren't some serious parallels. There are. It's just that it tends to lead to these really sloppy overgeneralizations, which end up, I think, diminishing. It's sort of like several years ago, PETA put out this stuff, the animal rights group, put out, it's one thing, like, if you're a supporter of PETA, that's totally cool. If you're against animal experimentation and factory farming and eating of animals, that's totally great. I get that, and I'm a vegetarian, and so I can appreciate that. But here's the thing, right? Like, if you're going to put out material that says, like Holocaust on your plate, which was their ad. They ran this ad called Holocaust on your plate that basically compared eating meat to being a Nazi. And the head of PETA actually said, Ingrid Newkirk is actually on record as saying, well, at least the Nazis didn't eat the objects of their derision, right? So in fact, and putting aside whether you think that it's speciesist not to make that argument, like maybe you think it's an example of some anthropocentric speciesist kind of horrible bigotry to eat animals, and I get that, but it's just strategically a really stupid thing to do. And then they had another one where they showed elephants being lynched, because I guess that used to happen, that was a thing. I didn't know that was a thing, but they used to lynch elephants in circuses or something. I don't know, it's the craziest thing. There's 3 pictures, and they were saying something like comparing that to slavery and the lynching of black folks, and it's just like, my God, even if you want to say that that is a horrible, horrible evil, why would you use language like that to try to glom onto someone else's movement to make your point? Like, the lynching of elephants is sick enough without having to make it about slavery and lynching of black folks, right? Like, the eating of animals can be argued that it is bad enough without having to make it about Dachau and Auschwitz, right? Like, it doesn't have to be that, but they made it that. So I just think we sometimes get sloppy with the way we make the comparisons, and we need to be careful with that. Yes, right back here.
What was the way I was going to ask this question? If internalization of these problems is so prevalent, if the internalization of racism and the system is so predominant, how the heck are we even supposed to start countering that?
It's a great question, and luckily there's a good answer, and it's an answer that I was glad to discover, because I will tell you that, and I didn't discover it, but I discovered that others had discovered it, right? I was very much like what you're saying. When I started learning about all this stuff and internalized bias, and I started experiencing my own examples of it, I was like, oh my God, this is so much deeper and worse than I thought, and there's no way, because the thing about subconscious stuff is, precisely because it's subconscious, it's really hard to get at. You don't know it's there. But what the researchers who've looked into this have found, and this is the good news, is that there are some techniques both personal and institutional, that can be used to get at internalized bias and interrupt that bias before it becomes a discriminatory action, which is really where the rubber meets the road and where the problem begins. So for instance, what they've discovered is that when people are in a position to evaluate others where discrimination might happen and where internalized bias might explain the discrimination. So it might be an employer, it might be a search committee at a college, it might be the admissions team at a college, it might be the scholarship committee at the college, it might be whatever, just whatever it is, somewhere in the private sector job market, looking at promotions, whatever it is. Anytime people are in a position to do an evaluation, if they are given even just a very simple 2-3 paragraph description of the findings on internalized bias, just letting them know, hey, by the way, there's research that says that even when we have the best of intentions and don't mean to do this, we sometimes do. So let's make sure that when we're doing our evaluation, we don't fall into these traps. Something real simple like that. Just simply making them aware of the larger social problem. Not necessarily saying, you've got this problem, but just saying, we all might have this problem, actually leads to better decision making. And so the people who have actually been taught that and told that, it's very simple. It doesn't have to be you don't have to read a full academic article or a book. It can be a one-page thing. And if people are trained that way, regularly and repeatedly, when they actually sit down and do the evaluation, what the studies have found is that they're much more deliberative, they're much more careful, right? They're much more likely to really look at things very carefully and cross all the T's and dot all the I's and make sure that they're getting it right because they want to get it right. That's the good news. So you have to take the subconscious and basically force it into the conscious mind, and that's how it's done. So one of these studies took mock juries who were watching a criminal trial. It wasn't a real trial, but they were told to take it very seriously. And at the end of the trial was a black defendant. The jury was all white. The evidence in the case was relatively weak, but it was strong enough that you could theoretically see a conviction or an acquittal as being justified. At the end of the trial, the judge gave the 2 juries, which had watched this in different rooms, but they watched the same trial, different jury instructions. The first jury was told, what the law was and how to apply the law, but they were also told, by the way, there's research which has found that even when we have the best of intentions, we sometimes fall into these traps about racial stereotypes, and so just make sure you're not doing that. Basically, they were given an instruction on subconscious bias. And the second group was just given the regular jury instruction without the subconscious bias piece. And when they went back to deliberate, the big difference was, the folks that were told to be careful about bias, they did acquit a little more often, but that wasn't the interesting finding. The really interesting finding was that they took longer, they took their time, they argued better, they had better conversations. So it seemed as though what they were doing was really wanting to make sure that whatever decision they came to was one that they could feel certain was based on their honest appraisal of the evidence rather than on the basis of those biases which they had been alerted to. In other words, it was like shining a light on them and saying, okay, don't screw up. And they were like, okay, we're not going to screw up. We're really going to pay attention. So sometimes it can be that simple. They've done that same kind of thing with scholarship committees, search committees at colleges. Just making sure that people are trained regularly, that's one thing. And that's an institutional response. That's something we can force ourselves to think about, but it's also something that institutions can do. Even if people's subconscious biases don't go away, as long as they are made hyper alert that they could be in the picture, then we can create policies and practices and procedures that interrupt those thoughts before they become discriminatory acts. Next question. Yes, over here.
Hi.
Hi.
I know at the beginning of your speech you talked about how we should support Black activists and people like you who are African American who come to speak. But I also think that on campus we have cultural clubs like Sankofa, the Black Student Union, LAO, the Latin American Organization, and CSA, the Caribbean Student Association. And we talk about race all the time. Like we have meetings every week and we talk about race. But we try to incorporate the whole campus, and we send out emails telling students to come to those meetings, but it rarely happens. Like we usually have meetings discussing things ourselves, like all the Black people's always in Sankofa meetings talking to themselves about race.
Right.
So what advice do you have like to students who don't come to these events? Because I think it's important to have those intimate talk about race. I know the Race and Racism Coalition have like these big things and like other big things, but I think it's also important to have these intimate conversations. So what advice do you have to
I think the only way, I think there are two things, right? One is that it would be really great to get everyone involved in the discussion. And so that's an obvious goal that one has. But I also don't want to diminish or discount the really valuable importance of those meetings, even if it's only the students of color who are coming to them, even if it's the same people over and over and over again. Don't think that that's failure, because actually what the research says is that those spaces that are carved out for and by folks of color so that they can create a sense of normalcy with themselves, at the very least, if it doesn't exist in the larger institution, are actually critical to their academic success, their psychological and physical health during those 4 to 5 years of college, however long it takes for folks to finish up. And so, even if it's true that most of the dominant group of folks are not going to show up, those meetings, those activities, those organizations still serve a vital purpose that should never be underestimated. And secondly, when it comes to getting people to come to events, I think really, and I was talking about this with some folks earlier today at a meeting at 3 o'clock, I think that institutions have to sort of themselves from the top down sort of remove the option of obliviousness, right? I talked about this privilege of obliviousness. Well, you can take that option away. Just like my school system could have said, no, you have to take calculus. They didn't, but they could have. This institution can say, well, actually, we expect a certain level of competency around issues of intercultural, interracial, whatever, communication and recognition of issues of power and privilege and inequality and how they shape the campus environment and how they shape the community at large in the country. The school can do that. The school can impose whatever it thinks is valuable for students to learn, and the school has, of course, mission statements. Both of these institutions have mission statements, right, that very clearly spell out their desire to promote all of these kinds of things. As I joked about in the 3 o'clock meeting, right, they always have mission statements that say something about creating lifelong learners in a global environment or something really innocuous but pretty like that, right? But how do you do that? Well, you do that by imposing a requirement that folks are expected to engage with the issues that make one a global citizen. And that means understanding matters of inequality and power and privilege and who has it generally and who doesn't. And it doesn't mean that we all have to agree at the end of the day about what to do about those problems. It doesn't mean we all have to vote the same way or have the exact same politics. It does mean that at a school that puts that out as its mission, that should be part of the gig. That should be part of everyone's expected curricula. It should be part of everyone's orientation in their first year at this institution, either of these institutions. It should be part of the curriculum going forward. It should be part of the evaluation process for faculty. It should be part of the tenuring evaluation process. It should be part of the graduation requirement. You know, there are schools that have imposed certain requirements upon graduates, law schools that have imposed pro bono requirements where you have to do so many hours of work with nonprofit or pro bono work with public service, public interest law in order to graduate, right? There are schools that have done that, and there are schools that have service learning requirements, but again, don't always do the solidarity model. They do the charity model, so that's another issue. But these are all valuable discussions that we could have. I think it's not going to be upon you as students of color to, you know, somehow figure out the riddle of the Sphinx that is going to get white students to come to those meetings or those events, right? That's going to be on the school to say, we're going to expect that these conversations will take place in the res halls. We're going to expect that these conversations will be part of orientation. We're going to expect that these conversations are going to be ongoing and that you'll be expected to take not just one class that fits some cultural requirement, where it can be broad and anything. I can take a class in Brazilian art and then I got my cultural requirement. Not that that's not a great class, but that's not the same, right, as somebody that took a class on issues of systemic injustice and inequality, because we're not going to be able to speak the same language. We got to get people on the same page, whether it's with one particular core class or a set of core classes, trying to figure out how to weave this into the different disciplines so it's interdisciplinary, not just the folks that are in sociology, right, or the folks that are in anthropology, or the folks that are in, you know, a particular department that's sort of a usual suspect. It also needs to be talked about in the science classes, right? Because we know that science has been used and misused historically to justify genocide and oppression. And scientists need to understand that, because scientists like to think that their stuff is objective. But supposedly objective science was used to justify murder of millions of people over the history of this world. And it was used to justify the sterilization of hundreds of thousands of American women, mostly African American and Native American women from 1900 to about 1972, forcibly without their consent by the state and private doctors. So that science you know? But it was misused, and if I'm going into science, I should know about that. You know, I think that we just want to really have these conversations. It's not for me to tell you what that should look like, but I think those are some of the things that should be in the mix to try to take away that option of obliviousness to the greatest extent possible. Yes? Hold on, they're going to bring you the mic.
Hi, I'm just wondering what your opinion on offensive humor is. For example, one of the more popular comedians today is Louis C.K. Have you heard of him?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I know.
And he believes that humor like his is necessary and almost beneficial because at the very least it gets people thinking about certain topics.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I think Louis C.K. is a genius. I think he's probably one of the best comics working. And I think that but here's the difference, right? And this is the difference, and it's a very fine line, and a lot of people don't know the line, and this is where it becomes problematic. Louis C.K.'s jokes about race, for instance, and his jokes about gender and sexuality, and his jokes about all these things that can become offensive occasionally and can seem offensive. The thing that differentiates those from racist jokes or sexist jokes or homophobic jokes is that if you pay very close attention to Louis C.K.'s humor, you'll notice that the butt of the joke is never the object of the oppression, right? In other words, the joke is not on the women who are the victims of sexism. The joke is not on the people of color. The joke is not on poor folks. The joke is not on gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender folk. The joke is pointed up the power structure, always in his humor, so far as I've ever seen. And this is interesting because it's also what Dave Chappelle used to do, and people didn't get it. Right? Dave Chappelle, also a comedic genius, and he understood if you watch the Chappelle Show, none of his people misunderstood. They thought he was actually ripping on black people. Like they actually thought that when he did that reparations skit, where it's like this is what would happen if blacks got reparations. They bring the the menthol cigarette truck and the malt liquor truck to the hood, and there's a run on the trucks. Like Dave Chappelle was not saying that's what black people would do. He was saying that's what y'all think we would do. The joke is on you, but unfortunately, white America didn't get the joke, right? They didn't. White America. I mean, I was in a dorm once. I was staying in a residence in a dorm at some school. The night that episode aired, I came down. I'm watching it. There's like 5 white guys sitting there. I'm watching it. I'm like, oh damn, I know what he's doing, but I bet they don't know what he's doing. And sure enough, man, they got at the end of that skit, the one white guy does this to them. He's like, that's exactly what they would do. And I was like, oh, damn. And that's why I knew when he quit his show, that was it. Like that, he realized he was too ahead of the curve. So it can be dangerous. Comedy and humor can be dangerous if people don't understand satire and what satire is and what humor is. But historically, comedy has always been, in order to be funny, and I know there are people who are going to dispute this. There are comics who would say there are no rules in comedy, whatever. I mean, historically, there have been unspoken rules. And my dad was a stand-up comic for many years, so I know a little bit about the industry. Historically, humor and satire in particular was always pointed up the power structure. So for instance, when the king would have the royal fool or the court jester come to entertain the royal court and tell jokes, who do you think he told jokes about? Do you think he came to the royal court and told jokes about the peasants at the bottom of the hill? No, that wouldn't do that. That wouldn't make him funny. That would make him an asshole. That would just be, that would be him coming up and going, oh, you should see these stinky peasants down at the bottom of the hill. And the king would go, oh my God, that's hilarious. Why don't we crush them under heel a little more, That's fantastic. I love it when we bash the poor, That would have been ridiculous. The jokes were pointed at the royal court because that was the one time you could make fun of the king and not get your head cut off or whatever, right? So humor was always up the power structure, and it's different. It's just not as offensive as when it's down the power structure. There is a social context within which jokes are either funny or not. It's like every year I get a little tired of it, I'll be honest, and I'm sure there are other guys in the room who probably do too. Like every year there's another sitcom, the plot of which seems to be, so far as I can gather, that men, particularly husbands, are complete idiots who can't really clothe themselves, can hardly feed themselves, can't diaper a baby, basically couldn't even walk without their wives to help them, and they're always just sitting around on the couch farting or whatever it is we do. Right? How many sitcoms do we have to have like this? There have been literally probably a dozen in the last 10 years. And as a guy, I sort of get it. I'm like, oh, really? Another one of these? And I roll my eyes. But I have to tell you, it's still less offensive than if we had a new sitcom every year that was bashing women. for being stupid. That would just be different. It would feel different. It would be different. Its social effect would be different because there's a certain armor that you have when you're the dominant group in a particular dichotomy that actually makes jokes at your expense not as painful. Like actually makes jokes at your expense not as big a deal. I'm not saying that therefore it's like open season on making jokes about white folks or open season on making jokes about rich people or whatever, but come on, making jokes about rich people is different than making jokes about poor people. It just is, because rich people are rich, right? And so they can buy like the protection from whatever that joke is going to do to them. Like that, what is it going to do? You know? And so like with Louis C.K., I think that his jokes do what Paul Mooney, who probably is the greatest comedy writer in the history of comedy, was Richard Pryor's head writer and a brilliant comic in his own right and a brilliant social commentator. Paul Mooney once explained this to a white reporter who totally didn't understand what he was saying, I think. But he said, you know, and Paul had no intention of explaining it to him because that's just how he does. He's just like, I'm going to tell this to you, and if you don't get it, screw you, I'm going to leave. He looked at the guy and he said, well, the difference is, if you're going to tell a joke, you have to leave me with an out, right? And what I think he meant by that, and again, he didn't go into like explaining what that meant, but what I think he meant was there's got to be an out, there's got to be an escape clause that allows me to escape with my humanity intact. And if the joke is coming at my expense and denigrating me and the group of which I'm a part at the expense of me in order to get your laugh, there's no out, there's no escape clause. I don't get to escape with my humanity intact. And so there's no out, and therefore it's not funny. Now, it's a very fine line, and I would not presume to know exactly where the line is, and I would not, you know, I try to take these comics one at a time and sort of look at their humor, and sometimes jokes I think cross the line, individual jokes, but the larger routine I think is really funny, and there's still value in it. And the good thing about comedy is, the one thing that Louis C.K. is certainly saying, which I agree with, is that if it forces people to look at these structures of society and look at the ridiculousness of how we deal with these issues, you know, which is what I feel he's doing when he does his routine. I mean, if you saw the film of mine, you know, we have a clip of him in the film where he does the bit about, you know, oh, I love being white. You know, and the bit is he's like, oh my God, you know, he said, this is not saying that, you know, white people are better. It's just that being white is clearly better, right? That's that, and he's talking about privilege. It's a joke about white privilege. He's not actually saying being white is better and people of color are inferior. He's saying it's easier. He tells his daughters, right? He says, I got these two little white girls, and our rule is like, you don't get to complain. Right? He goes, well, actually, you do get to complain. It's just black people get to complain a lot more, right? Like you can complain about it. So these are jokes which are at the expense of a larger power structure. This isn't even a joke that's at the expense of white people. It's at the expense of a system that produces inequality. He's really making jokes about whiteness without using that term and making it a sociology lecture, right? He's doing it as a comedy routine. I think it's hilarious, but I do know that when people are trying to be funny, we have this problem in this culture, and it's a problem that's, I think, intensified by social media and YouTube and all these opportunities people have to show their ass and think they're hilarious. Everybody thinks it's open mic night, and it's not. Most people are not funny. Most people don't know the first thing about writing or telling a good joke, and if you don't know how to do it, for the love of God, don't do it. Right? Like, if you don't do it, like, I mean, I use humor in my speech because I can, because I know how to, because I was raised to do it, and it's natural for me. But if you can't do that, like I've had people who speak about these issues that have never done that before, but they're like, I want to try that. I know, no, don't. Just do what you're good at. Like if you can sing, do that, but don't tell jokes if you don't know how to. If you know, it's a skill that sometimes people think they have, and then they tell a joke that's really offensive. There's a difference between racial and racist humor. Humor about race can be funny. Humor that comes at the expense of a race of people is not funny. Humor about sexism can be funny. Humor about people who are denigrated by sexism, not funny. Now, I do realize, and Jim Norton would argue this, that there's always somebody who can be hurt by any topic that a comic might talk about. This is true. So a comic that talks about, I mean, my comics always for years have done jokes about airplanes and flying, right? Well, I guess theoretically, somebody in the audience might have lost a loved one in a horrible airplane accident. They might go, that's not funny. You know, you're talking about crashing airplanes, and I had a loved one who died in an airline accident like that. I mean, you know, and so I think in a way, Jim Norton has a point. There are no rules that actually say you can't do jokes about this topic. So we're not going to say you can't do jokes about race, or you can't do jokes about sex, and you can't do jokes about sexuality and those things. It's not that the topic's off limits, because any topic could hurt someone in a particular audience. It's about being good at your craft to figure out how to fashion the joke and taking it seriously enough to say to yourself, you know what? I wrote this really funny joke, but you know, I know, like when I try to be funny, I know when I write stuff or when I say stuff, when I get a feeling if I'm crossing a line, and I know comics do. Comics can say they don't. They go, oh no, I don't think, no, that's nonsense. You know, when you write that joke, there's that time when you're like, I don't know about that one. It's really funny, but I don't know about that one. And I guess my advice would be, if you're that uncertain, don't tell that joke. There's lots of things to be funny about. There's lots of things to tell jokes about. On the other hand, if you're not getting that feeling and you want to try it out, okay, but if someone calls you on it, and if it seems to really create a lot of hurt and a lot of injury, then I think that's one of those jokes that you go, okay, I'm not going to do that one again. You know, a lot of comics have done that. Richard Pryor stopped using the N-word in comedy after he went to Africa, and he was still a very funny comic. Didn't change how funny he was. You know, so comics can adapt, comics can change. I happen to think Louis C.K. is a genius, and as is and was Dave Chappelle, and as are most comics who try to talk about this stuff. Most of the ones that aren't good at it, luckily, don't try. A few of them do, and we have to suffer them, unfortunately. Yes, one more.
You think that, would you say that the election of Barack Obama, the election and re-election of Barack Obama are a gateway to some very difficult times for Black America? And what I mean by that is, we see, say for example, in Chicago, 54 schools in the American city. That's a tragedy. And it's kind of going under the radar, and you know, funding for essential programs is being cut. And I think that after he leaves office, it'll be like, you know, hey, Calvin got hired at McDonald's. You know, remember him? You know, the doors. You know, there's no need for that dialogue.
Right.
So do you think that would take place after he leaves office?
I mean, it's already taking place. I already think the danger of the Obama presidency is that by not, again, understanding larger social context, which we haven't been given, and having a sociological imagination, which we haven't been given, most of us, it became very easy to expect that an Obama presidency was going to somehow usher in this era of opportunity and greater access for just other people of color just generally, that it was going to either symbolically or really have that impact. And I think that was always naive, because the larger system, I mean, I remember writing at the time that in a weird way, it's almost easier for a black man like Barack Obama to become president of the United States than it would be for him to have gotten the corporate executive position like at a Wall Street bank. Why? Well, because when you're running for president, or hell, even like the head of a department store. Why? Because when you're running for president, you got a couple of years to make your case to the people who are going to hire you. Right? They get to know you. You've got a long time, and you've got a couple 100 million decision makers. So the odds are that even if some of them really hate you, others might really like you. When you apply for a normal job, it's like one dude, right? Or a handful of people on a committee that are making the decision. And if they don't like you, you're screwed. Like, there's no vote that's put to the general public. So in a way, like, I remember when Will Smith was asked about this on Oprah during the election after Obama had won, but before he was inaugurated. And Will Smith made this really asinine statement that, you know, well, don't tell me that you can't get a job at Macy's or whatever. If Barack Obama can become president, we have no more excuses. As if somehow black folks had just been using racism as an excuse for not getting certain jobs. I mean, I guess when you make $20 million a film, you can take that position. But, and of course, Oprah totally agreed with it too. And she's like, yeah, absolutely. And that was nice, and I get it. But the problem is, getting that job at Macy's for the typical person of color might be harder because, again, there's not 100 million decision makers or 200 million decision makers. So I know that seems odd, but I think in some ways that's a more difficult thing, you know, in the regular economy where it's not a public venue and you don't get, you know, you don't get to say, here, read my memoir, I'm a really good guy. Like, that is what the president can do. So I think we're in for some difficult days because people are going to overestimate the importance of the Obama presidency in terms of what it means for black and brown folks generally. Secondly, those who are going to mark his presidency a failure, and of course there will be many who will do that, and I will too in many ways, but I'll be marking it as a failure, not of that presidency so much as it is the political system that generates presidencies that are really just leaders of the empire, maintaining empire. So my critique will come from the left of the spectrum, very different from the critique coming from the right, and his failure in that regard will be no worse or better than just about any other one's failure. But to the extent that the presidency goes down in the minds of a lot of people in the general population as a mixed bag or a failure, my concern would be that the stigma of that failure, so-called, will then attach to other people of color. right, who will either consciously or subconsciously come to be seen. Like there will be people who will go, yeah, see, we tried that, we shouldn't try that again, right? Whether it's the presidency or whether it's the head of the company or whether it's the professor at the school or whatever it is. It's like, and I don't know that'll happen, but knowing what I know about the subconscious bias research, right, when a person of color does something wrong in somebody's eyes or screws something up, it tends to stick in our mind longer than when a white guy does. So like George W. Bush, right, right, see, I don't have to say anything. Right. Next question. No, like George W. Bush can be, it doesn't matter what he did to the economy, it doesn't matter, you know, that he was responsible for the deficit, it doesn't matter all the stuff that he did or failed to do that could have done, it doesn't matter all of that. Nobody's going to say, man, I don't know, white guys, you know, they're screwed, they're never going to get elected to anything. Nobody from Texas will ever be considered for the presidency again. Apparently that's not true, right? And no Bush will ever be considered for the presidency again. I guess that's not true either. Like, you know, white guys can screw up things or do a really mediocre job of things at the very best, and it's not going to stick to the rest of us. And if a person of color does that, the threshold for acceptability is a lot lower. So that would be my concern, is that average everyday folks of color are going to have this burden of representation that was already there. It was already the burden of representing the group, already the burden of having to hold it down for all those folks. Now that burden is going to be intensified because it's going to be on both levels. On the level of, if Obama's viewed as a failure, that stigma might be borne by other black and brown folks. And even if Obama's considered successful, the people who view him as successful might be applying that standard and saying, why can't you be like Barack, right? Why can't you, you know? And the reality is, let's be honest, Barack Obama wouldn't be president if he had gone to Howard, not Harvard. And it's not because he would be a different man, and it's not because he'd be any less or more educated, or he would just be somebody who went to a historically black college, and that would not have the cachet that Harvard has, and we know that. We know that. And so if he hadn't gone to Harvard Law and Columbia for undergrad, if he'd stayed at Occidental, remember he transferred from Occidental to Columbia, if he stayed at Oxy's a good school, but if he stays at it ain't Columbia. If he stays at Occidental, he's not going to be president. If he goes back to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, right, where he lived, he's not going to be president. Not because he'll be any different, but because white America likes our black and brown folks to have the same kind of credentials that we like in our white folks. You know, so if you went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or wherever, that's all right, and we're cool with you because you are like, we will make you the Cliff Huxtable of our personal politics. You see, we will make you the Cliff Huxtable, and we loved us some Cliff Huxtable. So you know, we love that Cosby Show. We ate that up, and we like our black folks, lawyers and doctors, and wearing pretty sweaters and all that good stuff. But the minute that it's somebody who talks about race, you know, right, it's a very, very different thing. And so that's what I think is the burden that black and brown folks will have in the coming years because of this. I'm gonna take one more real quick and then I'll let you get out of here. Yes, right there in the blue.
Yeah.
I got you, Didi.
Cool. All right. So it seems that racism has been used in a way to create certain class hierarchies in the U.S. and that is enabled for the creation of or has enabled for the creation of an underclass in the United States. Do you think this idea of like racial equality or eliminating racism is compatible with an economic system like capitalism, which produces winners and losers?
Well, ultimately, it's obviously very difficult to have racial equity in a system of capitalism because it's impossible to have equity in a system of capitalism. I mean, that goes without saying, right? So no, I mean, the answer is no. You can't have full, I don't think, you can have full racial equality or the, you know, possibility of full racial equality in a system of, especially our system of capitalism, the kind that, you know, sort of global corporatist, monopolist kind of capitalism. Now, having said that though, I want to be very careful. And what I'm not saying is that the only impetus for racism is capitalism. I think that's a mistake that classical Marxists made, which is this idea that the class system is the source of white supremacy. It is a source of white supremacy. I believe that. And historically, I know that because I know the way that the class system was used to divide and conquer working class peoples of color from those who were from Europe. So we know it was used for that purpose. But it wasn't, and it hasn't been the only impetus. There have been others. Religion has been used to justify white supremacy. The media in the modern era uses, it's not just the fear of competition with regard to jobs, but imagery regarding crime and deviance and danger, which is not necessarily linked to employment competition, is used to hype fears and angers and anxieties and insecurities. And in our country, we have such a bifurcated labor market in many ways that to some extent, the vast majority of white folks are not actually in job competition with the vast majority of Black and Latino folks who are competing for totally different stuff. So in a way, the traditional Marxist theory, which would say that it's conflict between these groups that leads to racism, is true at the margins, but to the extent we have these bifurcated labor systems and networks, if we're not really in direct competition, that can't be the only thing, there's something else. So I think it was one of the initial engines, but I think after a while it's on autopilot. And after a while, it doesn't require the manipulation, active manipulation of capitalists, right? So, because at some point, what capitalists did and what capitalism did was it created this cycle, as Du Bois said, the psychological wage of whiteness, this idea that you might not have much, but at least you weren't black. At least you had this right here, this skin. And you could trade this. This was an alternative form of material good. This was, as Cheryl Harris, law professor at UCLA says, whiteness is property and has become property. And this is the difference between like a traditional Marxist view and what I'm saying is, a traditional Marxist view would say in order to get rid of white supremacy, you have to get rid of capitalism. I would argue if we don't make significant inroads in getting rid of white supremacy, we'll never get rid of capitalism. Because the thing that keeps capitalism together is, in fact, the whiteness and the property interest in whiteness. That's what keeps white people, working class, from joining with people of color, is, in fact, the implied superiority that the system has taught them. So unless we make pretty significant inroads in that, and diminishing that, there will never be the kind of class struggle that would be needed to actually fundamentally alter the economic system, because the white folks are more than happy to sit back and cash this alternative currency, whether it's this, or whether it's their heterosexuality, or whether it's their masculinity. These are all forms of property, right? I may not have much, but I can bank that. I may not have much, but I'm a big man in the house. I may not have much, but I'm a big man in my church. I may not have much, but And so I think we've got to, Marx didn't think about alternative forms of material interest because he wasn't thinking about societies that were fundamentally dealing with issues of race at the time he was writing. He's not thinking about these largely multicultural systems where white supremacy is operating. He's writing in much more monocultural type of setting. In Germany and in Austria and in England and in all of these countries, these alternative forms of property didn't exist. If you were working class, by God, you were working class. And the difference between those European countries and the United States in particular too, was that in those countries, if you were at the bottom, you knew there was no getting to the top. Like the myth of meritocracy didn't exist. If you weren't royal lineage, you weren't getting to the top, and you knew it. So working class struggle was always a lot easier in such a place because class consciousness was just about looking around. But in this country, it's very easy to steer people away from class consciousness with that myth of meritocracy by saying, yeah, sort of sucks for you right now, but if you work a little harder, it'll be better, and especially if you step on those people, right? Because they're the ones you have to climb over to get to the top. So I think even though the class system is completely embedded and implicated in the system of white supremacy, that it is not the only linchpin, and that if we're ever going to change the class structure, which I very much support doing, we're going to have to be talking to working class white people about the way that their actual class interests are not only damaged by the elite at the economic system level, but how they're damaged by whiteness and white supremacy, which has suckered them for so long. And if we don't make that argument, if we don't link the idea of white supremacy to that, because really white privilege is false consciousness in Marxist terms. White privilege is that thing that allows somebody to have false consciousness. And if I'm not aware of that, it's very hard to pierce the veil of that. So I would just sort of amend perhaps the normal class argument, but I would certainly say yes, that ultimately if we're going to have any chance of any kind of equity, and that's different than equality. Equality is where everyone has exactly the same things and they're exactly the same. That's not what equity is. Equity is where people are given the opportunity to aspire to and to accomplish and to have full autonomy and self-determination to do whatever it is they choose to do. It doesn't mean we're all going to have one TV and 3 toothbrushes and a refrigerator and 2 microwaves. I mean, it's I think people get this weird vision of what sort of socialism looks like or what more collective economics look like, and it's not that. Right now, I think at the very least we need to be talking about, if we're going to deal with racism or any other ism, we need to be talking about taking certain things that are currently commodities off the market and not having them be commodities. And I think among those things are the things that are necessary for the sustenance of life and the ability to exercise autonomy. That would be food, that would be shelter, and that would be medicine. The idea that food, shelter, and medicine are things that, well, you either get them or you don't, right, seems just horrific and inhumane to me. It's one thing to say you need to work hard for that big screen TV, or you need to work harder for that second car. That's fine. Those are not luxury. Those are not necessities or luxuries. But the idea that you should have to work so as to feed your children, I mean, you are going to work, obviously, but the idea that you should have to, like, if you don't make enough, and if you don't earn enough, your children just starve, and that's just the way it is, or they have to rely on some, charitable impulse of the church down the street, because we're going to make that a commodity. We're not going to guarantee food security. We're not going to guarantee housing, and we're not going to guarantee health care. It's going to be a market thing. And then when someone suggests we shouldn't do that, so you're going to have rationing health care, like socialism, but we ration health care now. We ration it on the basis of the ability to pay. That is rationing. It's basically saying to people that can't pay, you don't get health care, or at least you don't get the same quality health care. But we never criticize that kind of rationing, right? It's like, oh, rich people can get all the health care they can pay for, and poor people can only get what they can pay for, and we call that justice. And I think that's sick. So I think that there's certain things that we can definitely demarketize right now and take out of the commodities exchange, or begin moving. I mean, we're not going to do it right now, obviously, but we need to start talking in those terms as a way to chip away at least those the harshest vagaries of the class system in terms of what they do. And I think that if that were to happen, if we talk about that in conjunction with things like racism and sexism, if we knew that our health security was going to be guaranteed, if we knew that our housing security would be guaranteed and food security was guaranteed, as is fundamentally guaranteed in many of the nations with which we like to compare ourselves, then I think you would see a reduction in racism and sexism and other forms of bias, because that competition for those basic resources of life would be diminished. I mean, it would certainly help. So the two things are very much connected. I think we would see less of the stress that leads to that cutthroat competition that feeds racism if we were to take those fundamental things out of the picture of what we're scraping and fighting for. Because at least if I know those basic needs are going to be there, I'm not clawing at you to keep myself from dying, right? We'll compete for other stuff possibly. We'll compete for whether, you get that TV or this TV or that stereo or that, whatever. That's fine. That's, neither here nor there. But the basic stuff, right, we should probably decommoditize pretty quickly. And I know that's not likely to happen because we're so far from that conversation, but that's part of the conversation we need to be having. So thank you all so very much for being here.
So long. I know that it was difficult in the middle of the week. Can we have another hand for Tim Wise, please?
I have a lot of books. I have about 3 copies of Dear White America. I've got 4 copies of Colorblind. So if you want them, it's sort of first come, first serve. I have to take credit cards or cash either one time. But when they're gone, they're gone. So sorry.
Also, there is a blue box on the table as you head out on a bunch of scraps of paper. If you could write any reflections or things that you would like to see changed on campus or thoughts about the lecture, we would really appreciate the feedback. Thank you all for coming.